This is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. Today, I am speaking with two researchers from Holland, the Netherlands, and Sabine van Thiel and Kim de Jong. And I'm so grateful that they agreed to speak with me about a brand new study that just came out that is looking at differences between therapists on what is known as the Facilitative Interpersonal Skills Performance Test. And so, Sabine, Kim, would you just tell us a bit about where you're working? And then let me move on to a couple of other questions about your study.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Scott, for this opportunity to tell a little bit something about our study. Well, I'm Sabine indeed, and I live in Tilburg, and that's also where I'm doing this study at Tilburg University, Transo, which is like an organization at the university that really supports practical research. And I also work as a psychologist at a mental health care center in the west of our province.
And thanks, Sabine. And I think that people who are listening in, and certainly the way it struck me, it is a very practical piece of research that the application to helping therapists improve what they do seems to just jump off the page. So excited to talk to you about that. Kim?
Yes, my name is Kim de Jong, and I'm a researcher at Leiden University. And I also have a small private practice.
Perfect. And Kim, I know that you've been involved with routine outcome monitoring and really publishing a lot of studies that I've cited on my blog, trying to make a clear picture about what is it that's required to make routine outcome monitoring actually useful. So thanks for all of that research. We really depend on you to help us sort it all out. Sabine, the Facilitative Interpersonal Skills Inventory or Performance Test. What is that?
Yes, it's really a mouthful if you say it like that. But it's a test that is originally designed by Timothy Anderson, and it is a task in which therapists get to see and respond to very challenging client situations. Okay. And these responses are then recorded and scored afterwards.
On this particular measure, do they have 2 or 3 minutes to think up what they're going to say, write it down, practice it, or are they required to speak within a certain period of time?
Typically, they don't have a lot of time to think about it because they basically, at the end of the clip, they hear a voice say, "Now it's your turn to talk." And basically, then they have to give a response immediately. And in fact, if people wait for too long, take too long to think, we actually penalize that a little bit in the scoring methods.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it's designed to be a test of how people would respond in the real world if there were a real client sitting in front of them.
Yeah.
And I know you do a nice job of succinctly summarizing the research that's been done using the scale thus far, but could you just give us an idea about, well, why is this measure important?
Timothy Anderson they found that the FIS scores of therapists are significantly related to outcomes. And the high FIS therapist not only has better outcomes with their clients, but also higher alliances.
On the FIS, are you examining the therapist's technical expertise doing CBT? What are the alpha?
No, so it's called the interpersonal skills, and it says something about, for example, the verbal fluency of the response or the warmth and empathy the therapist shows out to the client.
So just to add to that, I think some recent research suggests that it is tapping into the concept of responsiveness, which is one of the contracts by Bill Stiles, that it really focuses on sort of, do you give the appropriate response? And when I train people into rating the FIS, we often talk about the layers in what the client is communicating. So are you responding to the top layer, which is literally what the client is saying? or are you responding to the needs that the client is communicating, which is sort of the layer underneath.
And so the critical piece about these FIS scenarios that are presented is that there is some complication. There's something unique, a bit challenging that you're asking the therapist to, or you're hoping the therapist will actually see. And
Yes.
then there are certain skills that emerge that are predictive of the therapist being more effective or less effective. Did I get that right?
Yes.
But like good researchers, you weren't satisfied with the dimensions on that scale. So what have you added?
When I was reading the items, I was really thinking that, okay, it focuses so much on the acceptance part and the warmth part. You could get an impression that therapy is only about being kind and empathic and warmth towards your clients. But as Dutch say, there can be no shine without friction. As a metaphor that without effort or discussion, the optimal result cannot be achieved.
And you found something.
We did. We defined 3 underlying dimensions of the interpersonal skills. So, for example, we found a supportive response dimensions, items measuring the therapist's ability to really affirm and validate and sympathize with the client. But we also found more expressive response dimensions, which was really focusing on therapist's ability to initiate change. And we also found a 3rd dimension, which was really not so much about what the therapist was saying, but really about how he or she was saying it. And we called it the persuasive response dimension.
And the assumption is, if I am understanding, that therapists who have these qualities in greater number or are more fluent with them are likely to have better outcomes at the end of care, to engage their clients more. Would that be a safe assumption?
Well, there's no direct evidence yet, but there is research showing that when therapists are too accommodating with their clients, they find it difficult to come to change.
And right now, while there's evidence that the original FIS scoring system is correlated with therapist effectiveness, what you're saying is you're in this early stage of teasing out the variables, testing, make sure that you can score these consistently. Did I get that right?
Yes, and with the new dimensions that we found, we might open up the possibility to delve deeper into the question, what types of therapists are effective for what types of patients?
Okay. Now, as you know, both of you know, even asking therapists to measure their results can be experienced by many as intimidating.
Yes.
It's like now you have skin in the game. You're putting your work on full display.
Yeah.
I know that your work, Kim, in particular, has focused on what kinds of qualities do therapists have that help them embrace this feedback process. Now you're talking about something highly personal, exactly what I say, and coding that. And you outline, I think there's 6 different types found in the data amongst the therapists who took your particular measure. Let me just give some of the names I gave for them. Yours are very scientific, but here's some of my names. You had type A, which is kind of your average therapist. They do a good job. You had type AEP, which I jokingly call the smooth talker. This is a person with a silver tongue. You have the HASP, HASP, which is this accepting, almost mothering type, that overly accommodating type of therapist. But then you have HSEP, which really jumped out at me, because you mentioned some of the work that our team has done on Superstrings and trying to understand what it is that leads. And this is kind of like your overachieving therapist. They just do it all. They're amazing. But my question is, will we be able to get therapists to actually look this closely at their results? What's your experience as you think about it and talk about it with people? Because again, when I look at these things, it's so confrontational, to use a word that you've used. I'm really going to see a pattern of how I interact with people.
Yes, I think it's a very important point that you're talking about now, because I indeed have the experience that this is a very intimidating instrument for therapists, which gives them a lot of arousal doing it. So maybe there's already like a selection bias in people who want to do and participate in this kind of study. My experience that some do get really enthusiastic, and they come out and they say, "Oh, I really want to discuss it with my colleagues because I'm really interested about how they are doing it, and I really want to know what kind of responses they would give to a typical client. And this is something I do every day and which I'm confronted with everyday situations in my work." But I also have the experience that one of my participants had a blackout and had to walk away and couldn't finish a task, didn't want to finish the task, and was completely overwhelmed. So yes, it is very important to think of ourselves like, how are we going to implement this tool in practice? How can we make it of a value for training, for development, assessment? That's really a question I am also really trying to figure out and really want to focus in my studies. Yes.
So to add to that, we actually have some research to support that it is indeed a very stress-inducing task for therapists, because we measured their physiological responses while they were doing the task. And we showed that indeed it is a very stressful task. And so one of the things that, for example, we do when we use the FIS is that we tell people this is a very difficult task, even for very experienced therapists. So you take kind of some of the expectation away that people have, that they have to excel at this just because they have that expectation of themselves, for example. So that helps a little bit. And the other thing that I found that has been helpful is to phrase it really in a developmental perspective and to really focus on, okay, now let's look at what are your strengths and what are points of improvement. And I do feel like that resonates a little bit with therapists in the sense that they're interested to hear about their own results and that they are kind of curious about it. So I think really thinking about that in terms of sort of learning with sort of zone of proximal development, for example, it is really, I think, about, can you stay in the zone of proximal development while you're doing the FIS task? Whereas I think in the case that Sabine just talked about, that was too overwhelming. So it was outside of the zone, and that's a moment where you no longer learn anything from it as well, because it's just too overwhelming.
Right. And this is something I know that we've been talking about in our work on deliberate practice, that this challenge of keeping people out of the performance zone where they're trying to show what they know, rather than in that learning zone, right at your edge. So just trying to get very specific, what are one or two things you feel like the average therapist listening to this might take away from the study about something they can do to improve their effectiveness?
It's one question that we still have, is whether these skills are actually trainable. That's an uncomfortable question to ask. I think there's at least one study that's pointing in the right direction, that it seems to be trainable, which is the Perlman study.
Exactly.
Which is also from Anderson's lab. So we do have some hope. I think if you really integrate a task like this into sort of the work with ROM, the work with deliberate practice, I think it fits in quite nicely, because what you would need most of all, I think, in terms of to improve yourself, is to get good feedback about how you're doing. ROM tells us to some extent if we're doing well or not, but not what we're doing well. But FIS actually gives you kind of actionable feedback on that. It tells you kind of like, okay, these are the domains that I'm really strong at, and these are the domains that I may need to do a bit more of development on. You know, maybe I'm not so convincing. What can I do about that? Or like one thing that I have been really surprised about is that there's little structural training on sort of how to use your voice in therapy. Whereas I do think we all use it, but there's no deliberate training on it, or in terms of like the pitch level, in terms of the speech rate, even variability. And we've been doing some research on that, looking at acoustic parameters and looking at how does that work with FIS. And then we see that there are patterns that change during the FIS task, that in difficult therapy situations, the speech rate is higher than in less difficult situations, and that people start to speak faster, for example, in difficult situations. And so, like, this is very preliminary stuff, but something like that could lead into something actionable. Like, okay, maybe I need to be more deliberate with certain clients. Maybe I need to lower my voice, keep my calm, speak at a slower rate. And with some clients, maybe I need to kind of bring the energy in the room, speak at a higher pitch, and do something deliberately with your voice. So I think ultimately, all of these dimensions, as well as I think the profiles that Sabine created, could lead into actionable things that therapists could do.
So the time we have to train therapists is limited. If in the United States, if you're a social worker, it's essentially 2 years post college. Psychologists, 4 years, maybe a year or two of supervised work. So we have to pack a lot in a very short period of time, because psychologists don't just do therapy, they do a whole host of activities. Should we be assessing or basing some of our admission decisions on clinicians' abilities in areas that matter, rather than the way we have done it, at least in the United States, which is high graduate record exam scores? We got a lot of smart people, but they may not be able to relate to others. So what are your thoughts about that? Would this be a use? And I guess that begs the question of, are these skills actually trainable?
Yeah, so it's really my personal opinion and my personal idea, but you could assess with FIS, but you still don't have any idea about which type of therapist would be most effective for which type of client. So we all want to have like the Superstrings, and we all want to think that we are the Superstrings, and all practices think they all have the Superstrings, but we will all have these different subtypes in our teams. And I think they can also be effective for different type of clients. So it's also as a team, or as a manager who is hiring a therapist, really think about, hey, what kind of therapist do I need? So one could think about that.
Interesting. Cool. In all of this, Sabine and Kim, I hear the seeds of a radical revolution in how we conceive of training. And I'll go ahead and say it so that these two very serious researchers I'm speaking with today don't have to go out on limb here. But I think when you mention, for example, voice modulation and using voice, something which actors all seem to know, and which I think therapists are going to intuitively sense, yep, that makes perfect sense to me. It's amazing that our field has done so little in this area. Instead, we've trained people the same way, to think in much the same way that we did dating back 50 years. That learned this approach, speak these particular words, and like a spell, it all works out. Do you see these seeds of a revolution in how we're thinking of training in some of the research that you're doing? Or for you, is it something else entirely?
I think there is indeed a revolution going on. Here we are already looking how can we give each other feedback on these dimensions.
And it sounds as though you're shifting subtly at the paradigm level, further and further away from this idea that psychotherapy works like medicine, and more towards really fleshing out the interpersonal interactions that may lead to change or improvement in a person's well-being. And am I overstating the case?
So we are making a shift here in the Netherlands to see how we can involve therapists more into reflecting on themselves. And I think especially because that is what the research tells us, that this self-reflection that seems to be the critical skill for therapists to get better. And the more we have in aiding that self-reflection process, I think the better it is.
Sabine, Kim, thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I look forward to the research that you will continue to do on the elements and the subscales that you've added to the FIS. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.